Okay, hello. I think we can kick things off now. Welcome to the first community seminar series event of this academic year. My name is Dr. Alice Butler-Walk, and I'm a lecturer in sociology here at Robert Gordon University within the School of Applied Social Studies. I organise our school's community seminar series, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming along this evening, and we're really glad that you could join us. Just a couple of housekeeping things to cover before we begin. There'll be time for questions at the end of this talk, and I ask that if you have a question, you add it to the chat panel for me to feed on to our speaker without us all having to navigate muting and unmuting and all of that kind of thing. You can do that as we go along, or you can just add them at the end during the question and answer time. This talk will be recorded and it'll be posted on the university's YouTube channel. Any questions that you post for our speaker will be put forward anonymously. So, on to today. We're thrilled to have Professor Andreas Bieler join us. Andreas is Professor of Political Economy and Fellow of the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice in the School of Politics and International Relations at Nottingham University. His general expertise is in the area of international relations and international political economy theories and the analysis of European integration, as well as resistance to neoliberal globalization, with a particular emphasis on the possible role of trade unions. And tonight, Andreas is going to be talking about his new book and the struggles for and resistance against the privatization of water. So I'm going to hand over to you, Andreas.
Yes, many thanks, Alice, for inviting me. Sally, many thanks for the kind introduction. Just let me share my screen with you. There we are. Okay, I trust you can see now my screen. Is that correct?
That's great, yes.
Brilliant, excellent. So thanks a lot for the invitation. And the title of the presentation is Fighting for Water and the Possibility of Alternative Futures. And as Alice has already said, that relates or is based on my recent book on fighting for water, resisting privatization in Europe. Now, before going into the contents or before moving towards resistance to privatization, let's have a look at why would actually somebody argue that we should privatize water? Yeah, and some of the names of the big corporations you can see here on the right-hand side is, of course, Veolia and Suez, the two huge French transnational corporations heavily involved in water privatization in Europe, but actually across the world. There's Thames Waters in the UK, managing, if one can call that managing, the water supply in London, as well as Acea Aqua, for example, which operates in central Italy. So why water privatization? Yeah, why would we actually move into that direction in the first place? What are the arguments for water privatization? Well, according to its supporters, there are 4 positive effects as a result of privatization. And these positive effects would all be due to the magic of free market competition. So what are these for? First of all, it would be more efficient if we had private water providers. Now you may ask, why is this the case? Why would it be more efficient? Well, the argument goes that thanks to the fact that different companies have to compete for a concession contract, as a result of that, of course, all the companies would do their best in order to get the contract. They would all make the most efficient possible offer, and the one which is then chosen in the end would be the most efficient one. So thanks to market competition, we have a more efficient supply and management of our water services. But it's not just more efficient, the result of private management, but the quality would also be higher. Because again, thank you to the magic of the free market competition, all the companies would compete with each other, and the one with the offer of the highest quality would ultimately be chosen in that competition, and therefore we as consumers would have higher quality of water distribution. Who could argue with that? Absolutely fantastic. So yes, let's go for that. The third argument is that not only would water distribution be more efficient, the quality higher, but actually there would also be a reduction in cost for consumers. Fantastic. Again, thanks to the magic of the market, not only do we get a better service, but actually we also have to pay less for that. Again, who could argue with that? And finally, private distribution of water would also be more sustainable, more environmentally friendly. If we allocate the right price to water as a commodity, as a marketable good, then of course we would also try to minimize our usage of water, and as a result, the whole management of water resources would be more sustainable. Fantastic. Now, on the basis of those 4 magic results, thanks to the private market, thanks to privatization, again, who could possibly oppose water privatization? The reality, of course, unfortunately, is rather different. The reality is that all privatization does is to engender a focus on maximizing profits. And in that, those companies on the right here, Veolia, Thames Waters, Acea, Aqua, Suez, they are very good at. They are very good at maximizing their own profits. But there has been a lot of research carried out by colleagues at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, as well as by colleagues at the Public Services International Research Unit at Greenwich University, which has made abundantly clear that private distribution of water, yes, while maximizing profits, does not result in lower prices. When water was privatized in some of the cities in central Italy, consumers were faced with an increase in their water bills by 100% and more at times. So prices of private water are actually going up. Water prices in the UK since the privatizations around the late 1980s went up by 50% over time. So private water is not resulting in a reduction in prices for consumers. Nor is the quality higher, because of course, if I maximize profits, I try to minimize investment in infrastructure. And of course, to maintain water infrastructure to supply the water to cities such as Aberdeen is enormously costly. It requires constant and regular investment. Private companies, they don't like that. They want to minimize investment in infrastructure in order to maximize profits. So really, what water privatization is about maximization of profits for private companies. That's the root problem in the whole issue around privatization. Now, in the book, the main focus is on resistance movements. Which are those resistance movements? Well, I start off by looking at the Italian water movement, which successfully mobilized around a referendum in 2011, in which more than 27 million of Italian citizens, that's more than 50% of the whole electorate in Italy, turned out in a referendum and voted with an agreement of 95% against water privatization. So the book focuses on this mobilization around the referendum in Italy in 2011. The book then also looks at the European Citizens Initiative, Water is a Human Right, which collected almost 2 million signatures in 2012-2013 in support of water as a human right and against privatization across Europe. Then subsequently, the book moves to the cities in Greece, Thessaloniki and Athens, and looks at the struggles against water privatization in those two cities. And in Greece, against the background of the Eurozone crisis, all the kind of national assets by now have been privatized, except for the public water companies in Athens and Thessaloniki. Thanks to these resistance movements, water in those two cities is still in public hands. And finally, I look at the struggles around the introduction of water charges in Ireland between 2014 and 2016 and analyze how widespread alliances were able not only to resist the introduction of water charges, but actually also make the government then in 2016-17 decide that they had to pay back the charges to those customers who had already paid. So again, a very successful campaign resisting this introduction of water charges. So this is the focus of the book. And the main question motivating my research was really, why has it been possible to mobilize so successfully against water privatization when in other areas of the economy, resistance struggles often did not succeed? When it comes to privatization of other areas such as postal services or the energy grid, very often there was no successful movement against these privatization attempts. Water is different. And why is that? What characterizes those struggles in Europe against water privatization, which underpins the success of these struggles? And I think there are three key reasons for why these movements have been so successful. First of all, and you can see that's my favorite photo of these water campaigns. The first reason for success is this unique quality of water. Water is widely appreciated as a source of life, and especially in the various religions around the world, water has a special place. And so it does also in Catholicism. And here you see a photo from the campaign around the Italian water referendum, where the priest reads the Mass, having the water flag draped over the altar during Mass. Encouraging the attendance of the church service to vote yes against water privatization in the 2011 referendum. And it's very clear, not just in Italy, but also elsewhere, people on the center right, people who would often vote for political parties on the center right, when it comes to water, they too would argue, well, it is such an essential source of life, it should not be used to make a profit. So water really transcends this kind of left-right divisions, and water campaigns, especially in Italy and at the European level, were at pains to avoid that water privatization became a left-right issue. They wanted to avoid, and did so successfully, that water would be used by political parties for their electoral campaigns. Their water went beyond that, and that's the first reason for the success of these struggles against water privatization. Now, the second reason of success is the fact that there has been a long history of water struggles across different geographical scales. At the bottom of this slide, on the right-hand side, you see a mural from the city of Cochabamba in Bolivia celebrating the success of people there against the privatization of their water services in 2000. And of course, for people in Cochabamba, that was a very local event, these particular struggles. However, the success of this resistance against water privatization in this Bolivian city reverberated across the world at the international level. Everywhere people looked at Cochabamba and saw what was possible. So in 2003, when we had the first alternative World Water meeting in Florence in Italy, Italian activists who had started to resist privatization of water services at the local municipal level in central Italy suddenly encountered activists from Bolivia who reported on their experiences. And they realized, look at that, the exact same kind of pressures these people in Cochabamba have encountered are the ones we have to face here. The exact same kind of companies which caused havoc through privatization in Latin America also want to privatize our water services, want to get their hands on our services in order to maximize profits at our expense. And so it was this kind of water-worn Cochabamba which really gained the kind of an international status, encouraging struggles against privatization elsewhere. And at the international level, at least, that was followed up in 2010 by the United Nations declaring water as a human right. Okay, so from the international level, we moved to the local level in Italy with these water activists encountering activists from Cochabamba. And as a result of that experience, they realized we need to move at a higher level. And in 2006, they established then the Italian Forum of Water Movements at the national Italian level. And you see the middle photo here. That's from the Italian water campaign around the referendum. It was the Italian Forum of Water Movements which really provided the basis for the successful mobilization in 2011. Okay, so that was the national level. In response to that success of the referendum in Italy, it was then key decision makers in the European Federation of Public Service Unions. Yeah, that's the kind of European level trade union which organizes all public sector trade unions. It was this success in Italy which in turn convinced then this European Federation to put in place the strategy for the European Citizens Initiative, because they thought, well, in Italy we have seen it is possible to mobilize citizens around water. Let's try and do that in Europe. And during 2012 and 2013, they ensured that almost 2 million signatures were collected across Europe in support of water as a human right and against privatization. And as a result, they could hold to account the European Commission as well as the European Parliament, which had to develop positions on water and how it should be dealt with in the European Union. During that process, for example, water was taken out of the so-called concessions directive, which would have indirectly implied privatization. So it was highly important in order to avoid that suddenly water privatization would become a European level reality. Now, from that European level activity, it was a shift then again down to the municipal level, because when the European Parliament heard the water activists from the European Citizens Initiative, it was activists from the Thessaloniki water movement in Greece, which followed those hearings in the European Parliament via video link. And being impressed with how those European parliamentarians were held to account, they decided that they too, in their city in Thessaloniki, wanted to hold a referendum. And so they did in May 2014. And again, a large majority of more than 90% of voting citizens, more than 95% of voting citizens voted against privatization. And it was this referendum in Thessaloniki, together with a constitutional court decision by the Greek constitutional court that water privatization was not constitutional, which then forced the Greek government in 2014 into abandoning the privatization projects of the water services in Thessaloniki and Athens. Yeah, so we can see how from the European level, there was a shift down to the local level in Greece, in Thessaloniki and Athens. Coming to the final photo of this slide on the top right, in the top right-hand corner, this is from the Irish campaign in 2014 to 2016. Yeah, and during the European Citizens Initiative, water was not really a live issue in Ireland. Not many people participated in that campaign. However, in 2014, when suddenly the Irish government, as part of the bailout agreement, wanted to implement water charges considering that Irish citizens were already paying through general taxation for their water services. So when the Irish government wanted to introduce this additional charge, people mobilized in opposition at the local level. And in a moment, we are going to move to this video clip. And I think it's important to remember that any kind of resistance, of course, needs to have a concrete locality. And that video, I think, provides a very example of this kind of resistance in Ireland. Yeah, so you had basically the construction workers moving in, protected by the police, to forcefully install water meters. And it was at the local level where people resisted this installation of water meters by simply blocking it. Yeah, sometimes people were jumping into holes where the water meters were supposed to be installed, or they just put themselves in front of those construction worker lorries. And Alice, if you could move, I'm going to, if you could move and basically make me stop sharing. Exactly, thank you. And if you go to the video clip now, that would be great.
I will share, and you can shout if you can see it.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, if you could stop sharing and then I share my screen again. Brilliant. Okay, so you should again see my screen now. Yeah, yep. The presentation. So I think, yeah, this very short video clip gives a very good impression on the concrete reality of this resistance. Of course, this resistance consisted of collecting signatures. It consisted of large demonstrations, but resistance is also something which always happens at the local level. And here people basically blocked the enforced installation of water meters. And this slogan, "No way, we won't pay," yeah, that has become one of the iconic slogans of these Irish struggles against the privatization of, well, against the introduction of water charges, which many perceive to be the first step towards privatization of water in Ireland.
Andreas, I think we are on your presenter view rather than full screen presentation. I don't know if that's easy to change.
Okay, can you see now my slide?
It's got space for telling us which slides are coming up next. It's okay, I just wanted to flag it in case you had any notes coming up that you didn't want.
Yeah, no, okay, can you see that fine. There should be the main slogan now, reasons for success number 3.
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Can you see that? Okay, perfect. Okay, so the third reason for success, yeah, so we had the special quality of water. We had these multiple struggles across different geographical scales over time, with water activists basically influencing each other. And then we had the third reason is broad alliances. And here on the right-hand side, you see the kind of logos of some of the key players. There were trade unions were involved. So we have here on the right-hand side, the European Federation of Public Service Unions, which really coordinated the European Citizens Initiative at the European level, but also locally in the various struggles, trade unions were key, and they really realized that in order to represent the interests of their members, it's not just enough to go to the workplace, yeah, and defend working conditions and wages. But workers, of course, are also living outside the workplace. And this privatization of water was also an attack on workers in their broader life, daily life. And so trade unions realized we need to go beyond looking at the workplace and try and defend the interests of our members more broadly. We had developmental NGOs, especially in the European Citizens Initiative, because they wanted the European Union not just to avoid privatization in Europe, but they also wanted the EU to stop promoting water privatization elsewhere in the world in its free trade agreements. There were environmental NGOs were part of the alliances, because many environmental campaign groups realized that the moment you put a price on water, the moment you maximize profit making, the environment is often the first to suffer. And finally, and that's quite important, yeah, environment, you see here on the right-hand side, the logo of the Lega Ambiente. And finally, there were also social movements, citizens committees at the local level. And I showed you that video clip, how people resisted at the local level. And also in Italy, underpinning the referendum campaign of 2011, were local committees across the country. And on the right-hand side, you see the logo of the water committee of the Italian city of Turin in the north of Italy. And so the fact that these campaigns were based on these broad alliances which cooperated, that was the third key reason for the success of these struggles. And actually quite a few of my interviewees from the various groups said that, well, we started off as a trade unionist, for example, but really we became water activists throughout the campaign. Yet the very basis of how those activists understood themselves also changed. Okay, so what is the transformative potential? Water as a commons. And I would argue that that's one of the really interesting elements of these campaigns against water privatization, that it was not just resisting against something, but it was also a focus on how things could be done differently. And it was especially in the Italian campaign that these notions of the commons was put forward. Because people realized if you just say, oh, the state should do it, that would not really result in much support, because many Italian citizens over time have become disillusioned with the state and how it often ran in a rather inefficient way, how it often ran the water services. So what they did was they developed this water as a commons notion, and they argued, well, water should be managed not by the state, not by private corporations, but it should be done collectively by everybody directly involved. Yeah, so water as a common should be collectively enjoyed, collectively managed, and collectively preserved for future generations. And of course, that only works if you combine this emphasis on the commons with new forms of democracy. So there was a shift really to this direct participation in decision-making, away from representative democracy and political parties towards people being directly involved in managing resources such as water services. The question really is, provided the commons can fulfill that in water, could we also think how the commons could become an alternative for other areas, such as public transport, for example, such as health, such as education? Yeah, why should it be just for water? Can we expand it further and really transform the kind of market economy into almost kind of a capitalist, post-capitalist economic setup? Now, throughout the campaigns, however, there were also other voices who pointed out, well, actually, in a city of Athens, where water is provided to 5-6 million people, how could you actually in practice ensure that those 5-6 million people would also be able to participate in the actual running of water services? And so actually in concrete discussions, there has been focus shifting towards how can we democratize public water companies. And there are a number of concrete experiments in Naples in Italy, Paris, as well as Terrassa in Catalonia in Spain, where people experiment with bringing the representative of user groups, of trade unions, of interested citizens onto the governing boards of these water companies. So in Terrassa, for example, they have established a water observatory, which is in charge of policy development. And this is been opened up beyond the kind of public water technocrats who would run the water service to ensure a much wider democratization of how this public water company is being run. And interestingly, I would say in the UK, we have this British campaign group, We Own It, And they, in 2019, published that report about when we own it. And I think it's worthwhile to read. There is the link in this particular slide to that report. They have provided a detailed proposal how we could organize the democratization of our renationalized services such as water or postal services, when it happens. In the UK, we do know that more than 80% of the citizens are in support of the renationalization of water. And of course, it was a prominent part of the Labour Party election programs in 2017 and 2019. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the transformational potential of once we have started working in this kind of line of democratizing these essential services. And there's a quote from that report: public ownership of public services is just one part of the jigsaw. Creating a more democratic economy is a bigger task. It will mean a number of alternative models of ownership. It will mean community wealth building across the country. It will mean unleashing cooperatives. It will mean public platforms owned and controlled by the people. It will mean tackling the vast inequality of housing and land distribution across the UK. There's the idea that once you start with democratizing, with renationalizing and democratizing these essential services such as water, once people realize the positive results of that, but there would be a potential spillover into other parts of the economy. And just as one example I could give you in this respect, when in 2010, water services in Paris, in France, were renationalized, in the first year alone, the now municipal water company saved 35 million euros. And that allowed that company to reduce the water bills by 8% for all the citizens in Paris. So this is really, if you think about lower prices, it's not private corporations, but it is public companies which may be able to deliver not just lower prices, but more investment also in the infrastructure necessary to maintain the water services. So coming to my final part of the presentation. So when I presented a book in another forum, very well-connected activist at European level asked me and said, but hold on, Andreas, I mean, how on earth can you actually argue that the Italian campaign was a success? Look at the concrete situation in Italy now. And of course, he's correct. Capital always comes back for another attempt. And the concrete success in the Italian referendum ensured that no further municipal water companies were privatized after the referendum. But with the exception of the company Acqua Bene Comune in Napoli, and you can see here the logo of that company, none of the already part privatized water companies in Italy were re-municipalized. The political sphere put in all kinds of blockages in order to prevent these companies to become fully municipalized again. And so, of course, the Italian water referendum was a success, but the full success, the full outcome of the referendum, Italian water activists would argue, and rightly so, I would say, has never been really put into practice. Secondly, recently, the Californian water supply has been quoted on the stock exchange in the United States. And there's an increasing shift towards the financialization of water. And that, of course, is an even more vicious form of privatization. People start making profits by trading in water futures, by betting on how much water would be available or what the price would be in the future. And so again, that is, of course, a development which undercuts those successful campaigns against water privatization. And finally, there's all kinds of private corporations which suddenly have started to adopt the language of water as a human right. And they say, yes, of course, we too support it. If you look at the websites of Suez, if you look at the websites of Veolia, they also say, oh, there are all kinds of ways how we want to contribute to achieving the sustainable development goals of the private corporation. Of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So there are all ways of how we as a private corporation can contribute to that. And there's especially a lot of technology companies with a focus on so-called smart water, which argue that they would be essential to avoid that there would be water shortages in the future. So capitalism, in a way, private companies have started to adjust to this discourse of water as a human right. I would argue still that this should not undercut the success of these water campaigns. But of course, within our capitalist setup, capital will always come back and make another attempt at privatizations. And it is for this reason that the struggle has to carry on. Yeah, la lotta continua. And with that, I'm going to end that presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. That was really informative and really helpful for kind of getting a sense of some of the issues that have been at play and that have been going on. It was really useful to kind of give a context to the questions that you were talking about. So I'm going to invite, if anyone has questions, they want to pop that in the chat box, and then I can put them forward to Andreas. I'm going to just start with one question really, which is about some of the kind of ways that we can think about the struggles that you talked about from a kind of theoretical lens, how you would recommend, or how you would see those from a kind of theoretical perspective when we're thinking about ways to understand water protests.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alice. So conceptually, I think we have to start by looking at the way of how capitalism is working. And so why is it that these corporations are so heavily investing in water? And I think we are in a moment where at the global level, there's a lot of private cash flowing around through the system in desperate search for profitable investment opportunities. And public water offers this kind of opportunity, because if something goes wrong, the state would always have to step in. If suddenly the water supply in London would no longer function, the state would have to come in and bail out the private corporations. So in a way, private corporations, it's a win-win scenario if you participate in this water privatization. And so in a way, one needs to look, I would argue, through a Marxist lens at understanding of why there is this pressure for water privatization. But at the same time, I think we need to realize that water struggles don't just take place at the workplace, but they also take place in the sphere of social reproduction. And I think it's very useful to look at feminist social reproduction theories in understanding of why water struggles don't just take place at the workplace. It's not just trade unions, but actually also these wider citizens' movements, which are highly important for the successful resistance against water privatization. And social reproduction theorists, feminist social reproduction theory, helps us in understanding these wider alliances beyond the workplace, beyond trade unions. And equally, I think, if you look at political ecology literature, which looks at the kind of exploitation and expropriation of the environment and how nature is being incorporated in profit-making by private corporations, resulting in the destruction, in the ecological destruction. Again, bringing on board political ecologists allows us to understand why alliances also included a whole range of environmental groups. So these kind of struggles are much broader, and that's reflected in the wider alliances. And so I would look at it through a combination of different approaches from a Marxist perspective on political economy, combined with feminist social reproduction theory, as well as this kind of political ecology literature.
Thank you. That was really, really helpful. And I I was going to ask about these sort of linkages between other forms of sort of nature-based activism, but I think you just kind of covered some of that when considering the kind of politically ecological ways of approaching things. Again, if people have questions, please pop them in the box. Otherwise, I'll continue to hog the space and ask more and more questions. There was something actually in the last slide that you mentioned about smart water technology. I just wondered if you could explain a bit more about that. I don't know if other people are familiar with that already, but it's not something I think I'm particularly familiar with.
So it would be, for example, you could say in agriculture, which is very heavy water dependent. Yeah, when it comes to the irrigation of fields, that you would have these kind of sensors and new types of technology, which would precisely evaluate how much water you need at what stage, so that you don't overwater and waste too many resources. And yeah, they basically want to sell themselves as a solution. What they describe is a kind of a natural phenomenon. Yeah, from a kind of company side, they would say, well, there is a shortage of water, be it because of climate change, be it due to the changing weather conditions. We can help in making sure that we adjust to that in the best way. And what is overlooked there is that actually it's not a matter of kind of technological solutions to shortages, but it's really about political struggles over how water is being distributed. Yeah, there are examples of California, for example, where during a drought, people had to reduce their personal water consumption. There was a hosepipe ban, while a company, I think it was Nestle or Coca-Cola, still pumped out groundwater from in the area of California in order to continue with the selling of bottled waters. Yeah, and so these shortages, of course, there's a link to the environment, but actually shortages are mainly the result of political decisions when it comes to water.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thank you.
And smart water tries again to come in there. Yeah, these technological companies, but ultimately they overlook this political nature of the struggles.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Okay, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. The first is, with the shift towards the right in England and the Labour Party in England, where do you think resistance could emerge to address current market ideology, for example, water?
Yeah, that's of course a big question. I think the defeat of the Corbyn-John McDonnell project is a big defeat in the UK also of any kind of attempts to move towards an alternative way of managing at least this kind of key service industries such as water, postal services, the energy grid. And as people reported, Keir Starmer seems to move away from the promise, which he initially accepted, but he holds on to this renationalisation agenda. So I think there are clear setbacks, but I would still argue when we look at this campaign group, we own it. The campaign continues. And I think it is our task to ensure to make the case for nationalised services and the benefits of nationalised services, including this kind of democratization of the running of these services in view of the counter pressures towards privatization. In the UK, of course, it's the NHS, which is very much at the forefront. And the slogan is free at the point of use, but what happens behind that is often that certain contracts are being given out to large US corporations or to Virgin, being also involved in the health sector. And that's, of course, a danger. And in that sense, the current change in the Labour Party also signals quite a defeat in that area.
Okay, thank you. So we have a comment here saying thank you for a very interesting presentation. As you mentioned in your presentation, capital comes back. I was wondering if you're continuing to follow the political struggles in Italy and elsewhere, and if so, has their strategy changed? And if so, how?
Yes, that's correct. So I'm still observing the ongoing struggles. And we need to remember, of course, to engage in these campaigns, such as around the referendum in Italy. Activists over time become exhausted. All of us who have participated in campaigns in citizens-based campaigns, we know how time-consuming and demanding it is. And of course, as a result of capital constantly coming back, there's also some exhaustion visible. But at the same time, I would argue there is still a nucleus of activists ready, which carry on with the fight. And just recently in Italy, for example, there was the 10th anniversary being celebrated of the referendum in 2011. And again, that really motivated, not just at the national central level, but also at a whole range of local levels, the alliances to come back together and to continue to put pressure on the government, on local politicians, that the remunicipalization of those companies which have already been privatized, that becomes possible, or at least that further privatizations pressures are being averted. Yeah. So I think, of course, over time, these campaigns are shifting towards the defensive, but they are still there, and there are still alliances at all levels in all different areas which continue to struggle.
Thank you. I think we've got a couple of hands up actually. So if you've got your hand up, if you could pop your question in the chat box, because the settings are such that we can't really unmute too easily. So if you could just pop that in there, that would be great. And in the interim, while we're just kind of waiting for those questions to come through, I was also curious about what you'd been talking about in relation to the potential from the lessons that have been learned from the struggles for water, in terms of how that can apply for and in other struggles and other sort of forms of resistance. And I wondered if you had any more to kind of feedback on that. Yeah,
thanks for that. And just briefly following up on my answer to the previous question, there is actually a meeting this weekend, 2nd and 3rd of October in Barcelona, where the European Water Movement meets and plans its next steps. Yeah, so that's, I think, is a sign of the continuation of those struggles. Now, what about these other areas? And that there have been campaigns, on the one hand, in the region of Puglia in southern Italy, but also in the northern Italian city of Turin, to expand the focus on water into other areas. And if you treat water as a commons, why shouldn't rubbish collection be treated as a commons? Why shouldn't local transport be treated as a commons? And of course, there needs to be finance in order to manage local transport. But the ability of making a profit with that, these campaigners would say, has to be taken away. And so the question is, why should we not encourage the kind of democratic participation of people in running those essential services, not just in water, but also in related areas? To date, I would argue one has to say that those struggles haven't been as successful as water. And it just indicates that water has this unique quality. Yeah, for people on the center right, to privatize postal services, to privatize our transport systems, they wouldn't blink an eye. Yeah, it's only when it comes to water. And so I think that takes quite a lot of struggle of convincing people that it's not just water, but also other areas. And I think that's the way of how we can see the transformational potential, that provided you can start with water, once people see the positive benefits of managing it as a commons, I think it will become easier to convince them that also other areas can be run as commons. You know, so it's a process. It's not something you do in one full sweep and everything would be solved.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, yeah, going back to what you're talking about the sort of almost the symbolic power of water and its actual sort of physical powers that we see in society, that makes a lot of sense, that it would be that kind of transformative movement that can direct others, I suppose, and it can be a moment of learning going forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So while anyone kind of finalizes putting any questions, oh yeah, here we go, question. In South Africa, residents from a community called Piri won a case against the Johannesburg City Council in the Constitutional Court that water is a human right. Of course, the South Africa Constitution leaves a loophole whereby the government has to show that they're working towards the achievement of socioeconomic rights. But the residents of Soweto did win the right to 600 free litres of water per month per household. Excellent fight of resistance. Any thoughts?
Yeah, very good example. So what struggles against water privatization or struggles for water as a human right are, of course, not just taking place in Europe and South Africa. Especially, we have a heavy contestation over water, and at least the right to 600 liters free. That's one of the successes. Yeah, and at the same time, we have seen in South Africa how there's also a relentless focus on privatization, also of energy, for example, and water in other areas. But South Africa is one of those countries where, with prominent struggles, successes and setbacks. And very clearly, it's important to remember, it's not just a European phenomenon, it's also a global phenomenon. And actually, European struggles have learned from the defeats and successes in other parts of the world. So I think water is an interesting example because it's one of the areas where it's not just, as so often, the North who tries to teach the South how things should be done, but actually water is one of the areas where the North realized we can actually learn a lot from struggles in the global South. And that's how Italian activists directly learned from the success in the Cochabamba water war in 2000, and then implemented lessons in Italy. So when it comes to water, there's a much freer flow across different levels when it comes to learning of how the struggle can be successfully waged.
Thank you. We also have another message saying thank you. Here in the US, forces of privatization, commodification, and financialization are similarly very strong and are accelerating with Wall Street water hedge funds and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange future water contracts. One of the most promising principles to counter this growing threat is the public trust doctrine, which holds that water ownership is vested in the people. Is this an avenue that folks have explored in Britain and the EU?
Very good example from the United States. And yes, I mean, a lot of water services have been remunicipalized in the United States. When we look at where has it been possible successfully to resist privatization or to turn processes back, it's Western Europe and North America. And this idea of trust, I haven't come across that in Europe. That might be a particular US feature, but I think that's, again, a very good example of how creatively water movements can generate actually knowledge in struggle in order not just to resist the privatization, but to also come up with alternatives of how water should be managed. So thanks for bringing that example to our attention. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to see some of the kind of non-European examples as well coming out to kind of highlight what you were saying, that the global sense of water protests. Okay, so I think for the last couple of minutes then we can just sort of wrap things up and say a huge thank you to Andreas for coming along and presenting and for kicking off our seminar series for the next academic year in great style. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to invite all of you to come to our next event, which is on a Wednesday, unusually, Wednesday the 20th of October, with Emma Dowling, who will be talking about fixing the crisis, care in the wake of the pandemic. Emma is the author of The Care Crisis, What Caused It and How Can We Fix It? So hopefully, if you're interested, do come along. Keep an eye on our Eventbrite page. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. My email address was on the Eventbrite page for this event. So please get in touch, and really, really hope that we can see you again next time as well. So thank you again, Andreas, and thank you to everyone for coming along. It was great to see people turning out. So thank you so much.